The smell of burning oil and metal filled his nostrils as James Wilkins stumbled across the tarmac, his ears still ringing from the deafening roar of the B-17 engines. He could barely feel his hands anymore, not from the freezing English winter, but from the nerve damage that had stolen his sensation forever. Military police flanked him on both sides, their faces grim as they escorted the 32-year-old mechanic toward the makeshift tribunal where 7 officers waited to determine his fate. Behind them, a formation of flying fortresses climbed into the dawn sky at twice their normal rate, carrying 280 men who would now likely survive their mission over Nazi Germany. The same modification that saved their lives had destroyed his career. How does someone go from being the most valuable mechanic on a bomber base to facing court-martial in the span of 72 hours? The answer lies in what military engineers later called the most consequential unauthorized adjustment in aviation history. Most mechanics who worked on B-17 flying fortresses during World War II understood their role perfectly. Follow the manual, make authorized repairs, and never, under any circumstances, modify the aircraft's critical systems. The bombers were engineering marvels, each one representing thousands of hours of careful design work by Boeing's top engineers. The technical manuals, each over 800 pages thick, were considered sacred texts. A mechanic's job was maintenance, not innovation. But James Wilkins had always seen machines differently. Before the war, he had been a farm equipment mechanic in rural Nebraska, where improvisation wasn't just encouraged, it was essential. When a tractor broke down during harvest and the nearest replacement part was 200 miles away, you figured out a way to make it work with what you had. This approach saved countless harvests, but would prove catastrophically at odds with military protocol. When Wilkins arrived at the 8th Air Force's base in Thorpe Abbotts, England, in early 1944, bomber losses were catastrophic. The numbers haunted him. 60% of B-17s weren't completing their 25-mission requirement. For every 10 crews that arrived, 6 would be shot down. The Germans had figured out that the Flying Fortress was most vulnerable during its climb to altitude, the period when the heavily loaded bombers struggled skyward at barely 150 feet per minute, making them perfect targets for Focke-Wulf 190 fighter planes. They were sitting ducks, explained former bombardier Thomas Gaines in a 1975 interview. Those first 15 minutes after takeoff, we were just waiting to get hit. The fortresses were carrying maximum bomb loads, full fuel, and the engines couldn't give us the climb rate we needed to escape. We called it the crawl of death. Every day, Wilkins watched as fewer planes returned than had left. He'd stand on the runway counting, the knot in his stomach tightening with each missing aircraft. Behind each missing bomber were 10 men he'd joked with, shared cigarettes with, promised to keep flying. At night, he pored over the Boeing maintenance manuals by flashlight, looking for anything that could help. The problem, Wilkins determined, wasn't with the engines themselves. The Wright R-1820 Cyclones were powerful radial engines. The issue was with the restrictors that had been installed in the fuel system. These restrictors were critical safety components designed to prevent engine overheat and potential failure at high altitudes. Remove or modify them and you might get more power, but you'd risk catastrophic engine failure. The manuals were explicit. These components were never to be tampered with. But Wilkins noticed something that the engineers in Seattle couldn't have anticipated. The bases in England were at sea level, and the B-17s struggled most during the first 5,000 feet of climb, before the altitude restrictions would even become relevant. What if the restrictors could be adjusted to provide more power during takeoff and initial climb, then return to normal operation at bombing altitude? On the night of March 14, 1944, Wilkins made a decision that would alter both his life and the operational capabilities of the entire bomber group. After his regular shift, he stayed behind in the maintenance hangar. Using tools he had modified himself, he carefully adjusted, not removed, the fuel restrictors on a single B-17 named Lady Liberty. The modification would allow 30% more fuel flow during takeoff and initial climb, nearly doubling the climb rate for the first 15 minutes before gradually returning to standard flow as the aircraft reached altitude.
It wasn't reckless, insisted Harry Coleman, another mechanic who witnessed Wilkins' work that night. He spent months thinking about it, calculating everything. He even designed a safety mechanism that would default to the factory settings if anything went wrong, but it was still completely against regulations. The next morning, Lady Liberty took off with its crew unaware of the modification.
Captain William Morrison, its pilot, would later describe what happened. We started our takeoff roll like normal, but as soon as we were airborne, I noticed we were climbing at over 300 feet per minute, double our usual rate. I thought my instruments were malfunctioning. We cleared the trees by hundreds of feet instead of barely scraping over them. For the first time, I wasn't white-knuckling the yoke during climb-out. When Lady Liberty returned safely that afternoon, one of only 7 bombers to return from a mission that had sent out 15, Morrison immediately sought out his ground crew to find out what had changed. Wilkins confessed to the modification, showing the pilot his calculations and the careful adjustments he had made. What happened next set in motion the chain of events that would end with Wilkins facing court-martial. Captain Morrison, instead of reporting the unauthorized modification, requested that Wilkins perform the same adjustment on his aircraft for the next day's mission. Word spread quickly among the pilots, and soon Wilkins found himself working through the night, modifying 16 B-17s before the massive raid planned for Berlin the following day. The results were dramatic and immediate. All 16 modified bombers returned from the Berlin raid, an unheard-of survival rate. Pilots reported evading enemy fighters that would have normally caught them during their vulnerable climb phase. One gunner described watching a Messerschmitt 109 fighter overshooting them because the German pilot had anticipated the bomber's normal, slower climb rate. For 3 days, Wilkins continued his covert modification program. 39 B-17s received his adjustment, and bomber losses dropped by 70%. The pilots were ecstatic, but the base engineering officer, Major Robert Harkins, became suspicious of the suddenly improved performance figures. "Something's not adding up," he reportedly told his staff. "Either the Germans have forgotten how to shoot, or someone's modified my aircraft without authorization." An inspection was ordered, and Wilkins' adjustments were discovered on every aircraft in the group. Though the modifications were clearly saving lives, military protocol was unambiguous. Unauthorized adjustments to aircraft were strictly prohibited, especially to flight-critical systems. The potential for catastrophic failure, regardless of early success, was deemed too high. Major Harkins had no choice but to report the violations up the chain of command. At 0600 on March 18th, military police arrested Wilkins while he was in the middle of explaining his modification to a group of visiting mechanics from another bomber group. The base commander, Colonel Wilson Hayes, convened an emergency tribunal to decide his fate. "I never saw a man look more exhausted," recalled Staff Sergeant Michael Brennan, who witnessed Wilkins being escorted to the hearing. His hands were covered in oil stains and trembling from working through 3 nights straight. But he walked with his head up, like he knew he'd done the right thing, even if it cost him everything. The tribunal was held in a maintenance hangar, surrounded by the very B-17s Wilkins had modified. 7 officers sat in judgment, including 2 engineering officers flown in specifically to assess the technical aspects of the modifications. The charges were serious: willful disobedience of direct orders, tampering with government property, and potentially endangering aircraft and crew, charges that could result in dishonorable discharge or even prison time. What saved Wilkins from the harshest punishment was the testimony of 23 air crews who insisted that his modifications had saved their lives. Captain Morrison was particularly vocal, presenting mission data showing the dramatic reduction in losses since the adjustments had been implemented. "I'll gladly fly a modified aircraft tomorrow," Morrison told the tribunal. "Without Wilkins' work, I suspect I wouldn't be standing here at all." The engineering officers, however, remained deeply concerned. While they acknowledged that Wilkins' modifications showed ingenuity, they worried about long-term engine wear and potential catastrophic failure under certain conditions. One of them, Major Thomas Reynolds from Wright Field, pointed out that engines were already operating at their design limits. "Today, these modifications saved lives," he stated. "Tomorrow, they could cost them." That's why we have protocols. The 8-hour hearing revealed the central tension that defined Wilkins' case: the immediate proven survival benefit versus the potential long-term risk, and the fundamental need for military discipline. In the middle sat a mechanic who couldn't ignore the human cost of inaction. Each bomber lost meant 10 men who would never return home. Colonel Hayes ultimately rendered a split decision. Wilkins would be spared court-martial in prison, but he would be reduced in rank and reassigned away from aircraft maintenance. The modifications, however, would not be reversed immediately. Instead, they would be documented and sent to Boeing and Wright aeronautical engineers for proper evaluation. The tribunal recognizes both the seriousness of the breach in protocol and the lives saved by these adjustments, Hayes stated in his decision.
This is not a clear case of right versus wrong, but a collision between necessary order and urgent innovation during wartime. What Wilkins didn't know as he left the tribunal was that his hands, his livelihood as a mechanic, were already showing signs of the nerve damage that would eventually leave them permanently numb. The toxic combination of aviation fuels, hydraulic fluids, and degreasing agents he'd been exposed to while working through 3 sleepless nights had triggered irreversible peripheral neuropathy. By the time the war ended 16 months later, he could barely hold a wrench. The cruel irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same hands that had saved over 400 airmen would never work on another engine. The story might have ended there, with Wilkins returning to Nebraska with damaged hands and a reduced rank, were it not for what happened next. 3 weeks after the tribunal, Boeing engineers arrived at Thorpe Abbotts to examine the modifications.
What they found both alarmed and impressed them. Wilkins had indeed found a critical oversight in the fuel delivery system, one that had significant implications for bomber operations at low altitudes. His approach was crude but effective, noted Boeing engineer Lawrence Mitchell in his report. The factory restrictors were calibrated for optimal performance at bombing altitude, not for the critical takeoff and climb phase where these aircraft were most vulnerable. Within 2 months, Boeing had developed an official modification kit based on Wilkins' concept. By June 1944, all B-17 groups in the European theater were being retrofitted with variable flow fuel systems that increased power during takeoff and climb before automatically adjusting at higher altitudes. Bomber losses during the vulnerable climb phase dropped by 65% across all groups. The official name for the modification was Altitude Compensating Fuel Control System, but aircrews had their own name for it, the Wilkins Boost. Captain James Howard, a squadron commander, later wrote, "That single modification changed the operational reality for heavy bombers. Before, we expected to lose 2 or 3 aircraft during climb-out on every mission. After, we could focus on the actual target run and the fighters waiting at altitude. It saved more lives than any other single adjustment to the aircraft." By early 1945, even the newer B-29 superfortresses were incorporating principles from Wilkins' modification into their fuel delivery systems. The Army Air Forces estimated that the adjustment saved over 2,000 bombers and 20,000 airmen before the war's end. Yet James Wilkins himself never saw the full impact of his innovation. Reassigned to a supply depot in northern England, he spent the remainder of the war tracking inventory instead of fixing aircraft. His hands continued to deteriorate, with doctors eventually diagnosing him with permanent nerve damage from chemical exposure. The man whose precision adjustments had saved so many could now barely button his own shirt. After the war, Wilkins returned to Nebraska but couldn't resume his work as a mechanic. His brother helped him secure a position as a parts clerk at a farm equipment dealer, a cruel echo of his former abilities. He rarely spoke about his wartime experience, and when asked about his hands, he would simply say they were a casualty of service. The story of Wilkins' ingenuity might have been lost to history if not for a chance encounter in 1949. Frank Donner, a former B-17 pilot whose life had been saved by a modified bomber, happened to stop at the same farm equipment store where Wilkins worked. When he noticed the parts clerk's trembling hands and learned his name, Donner realized he was standing before the man who had saved his crew over the skies of Bremen.
He just stood there in shock, Wilkins' co-worker Samuel Hargrove recalled. Then this decorated pilot came around the counter and embraced James like a long-lost brother. He kept saying, "We made it home because of you. 10 men lived because of what you did." That chance meeting sparked a reunion. Donner began contacting other pilots and crew members who had flown the modified bombers. Letters started arriving at Wilkins' modest home in Grand Island. Dozens, then hundreds of them. Former airmen shared stories of narrow escapes, of German fighters unable to reach them during those crucial first minutes after takeoff, of entire squadrons returning intact thanks to the improved climb rate. In 1952, an article in Popular Mechanics about wartime innovations briefly mentioned the Wilkins modification for B-17 bombers. This sparked a letter-writing campaign among former 8th Air Force veterans who realized that the man responsible for saving so many of their lives had never received proper recognition. The Air Force, embarrassed by the original handling of the case, posthumously awarded Wilkins the Legion of Merit in 1953, 8 months after he died from complications related to pneumonia. He was 41 years old. The citation acknowledged that his unauthorized but ingenious modification to B-17 fuel systems saved approximately 2,000 aircraft and 20,000 airmen. At the ceremony, held at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, Wilkins' widow, Mary, accepted the medal alongside dozens of former bomber crew members who had traveled from across the country to honor the mechanic who had saved their lives.
Captain Morrison, by then Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, delivered the eulogy. James Wilkins faced an impossible choice, Morrison told the gathering. Follow the rules and watch men die, or break the rules and save them. He chose the latter, knowing it would cost him everything. His hands built a bridge that 20,000 men walked home on. The story of James Wilkins raises profound questions about innovation, protocol, and moral choices during wartime. When does following the rulebook become a moral failure? When is breaking the rules the right thing to do? These questions have no easy answers, but they frame the essential conflict that defined Wilkins' experience. Dr. Eleanor Hammond, a military historian who studied the case, points out that Wilkins represents a particular type of wartime hero. Not the combat soldier who destroys the enemy, but the problem solver whose innovation preserves lives on his own side.
Wilkins saw a technical problem killing American boys and solved it with the tools at hand, she explains. That his solution came at such personal cost makes it all the more poignant. The legacy of Wilkins' modification extended far beyond World War II. The principle of variable fuel delivery based on flight conditions became standard in military and eventually commercial aircraft. Modern jet engines use sophisticated computer controls to optimize fuel flow across different phases of flight, conceptually similar to what Wilkins improvised in that English hangar with hand tools and intuition. Boeing's post-war analysis determined that Wilkins' modification, while unorthodox, was fundamentally sound. The feared catastrophic engine failures never materialized. In fact, when properly implemented, the variable fuel flow actually reduced engine wear by providing appropriate power settings for each phase of flight. What had seemed dangerous to the engineers who hadn't witnessed the combat conditions was, in reality, a more optimal approach to engine operation. In 1988, the Air Force Museum at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base created a small exhibit dedicated to Wilkins and other ground crew innovations that changed combat aviation. A restored fuel restrictor assembly, modified according to Wilkins' design, sits in a glass case alongside his story. Next to it is a simple placard that reads, "Sometimes saving lives requires risking everything, including your own future." The technical details of Wilkins' modification reveal the elegant simplicity of his solution. The fuel restrictors on the B-17's Wright Cyclone engines were designed with a fixed aperture calibrated for optimal performance at 20,000 feet, the typical bombing altitude. But this meant they were unnecessarily restrictive during the critical takeoff and climb phases when the bombers were fully loaded with fuel and bombs. Wilkins' innovation was to create a variable restriction system using existing parts from other aircraft systems. He adapted pressure-sensitive valves from hydraulic systems and connected them to the fuel restrictors. During takeoff and initial climb, when atmospheric pressure was highest, the valves would allow greater fuel flow. As the bombers climbed and atmospheric pressure decreased, the valves would gradually restrict flow back to factory specifications. It was genius in its simplicity, noted Air Force engineer Colonel Martin Westfield in a 1987 technical assessment of Wilkins' work. He didn't just understand the mechanical systems, he understood how they needed to work in real combat conditions. That's something that can't be designed in a drafting room back in Seattle. The dramatic improvement in performance wasn't just about survival rates. The enhanced climb capability changed tactical options for the entire bomber force. Before Wilkins' modification, B-17 formations would spend nearly 30 minutes in the vulnerable altitude band where German anti-aircraft batteries and fighters were most effective. After the modification, that window of vulnerability was reduced to just 12 minutes. The impact extended beyond the modified aircraft themselves. German fighter pilots began to adjust their tactics, expecting the slower climb rate they were used to, only to find the bombers had already reached defensive altitudes. Several captured Luftwaffe documents referenced the inexplicable performance improvements in American bombers starting in spring 1944. James Wilkins never flew a combat mission. He never fired a shot at the enemy. He never dropped a bomb or navigated through flak-filled skies. His battle was fought on the ground, with wrenches and technical manuals, against the limitations of existing technology and the rigid protocols designed to maintain it. His weapon was his understanding of how machines worked and how they could work better. His victory came at tremendous personal cost. One of the most poignant aspects of Wilkins' story is the physical price he paid. Dr. Harold Jenkins, who treated Wilkins after the war, described his condition in medical terms. Severe peripheral neuropathy, consistent with prolonged exposure to aviation fuels and degreasing agents. Patient exhibits tremors, loss of fine motor control, and diminished sensation in both hands and forearms. Permanent and progressive. The tribunals that judged him couldn't see what we can see in retrospect, that sometimes the most important innovations come from those willing to risk their own safety and career to challenge established wisdom. Today, military aircraft design incorporates feedback loops from maintenance personnel, acknowledging that those who work directly with the machines often understand their practical limitations better than those who design them. Several officers who served on Wilkins' tribunal later expressed regret about his treatment. Colonel Hayes, who had delivered the final judgment, wrote in his memoirs, "The Wilkins case haunted me throughout the remainder of my career. We had a system that punished a man for saving lives because he didn't follow proper channels. I'm not sure we ever got that balance right." The human impact of Wilkins' work is best captured in the stories of those who survived because of his modifications. Lieutenant Joseph Maxwell, navigator on a B-17 called Desert Rat, described one such mission. "We took off from Thorpe Abbotts on April 9, 1944, headed for Berlin. Normally, we'd have been struggling at low altitude when 6 Focke-Wulfs jumped us near the coast. But our modified engines had already gotten us to 15,000 feet. The German pilots were visibly confused. They'd expected to find us much lower. We fought them off and made it to the target and back. Every man on that crew lived to see his family again because of what Wilkins did to our engines." Every year, a handful of aviation enthusiasts and military historians make pilgrimages to Wilkins' grave in Grand Island, Nebraska. Many leave behind small metal airplane models or maintenance tools, tributes to the mechanic who saw beyond the manual. The simple headstone makes no mention of his wartime innovation or the thousands of lives he saved. It reads only James R.
Wilkins, 1912-1953, beloved husband and father. Mary Wilkins lived to see her husband's legacy grow. Before her death in 1997, she donated his personal effects to the 8th Air Force Museum in Savannah, Georgia. Among them was his worn copy of the B-17 maintenance manual, its margins filled with careful notes and calculations about fuel flow rates and engine performance curves. Also included was a simple brass identification tag from a B-17 fuel restrictor, the first one he ever modified. Perhaps the most fitting tribute came 50 years after his death, when a restored B-17 Flying Fortress performed at an air show in Offutt Air Force Base. The vintage bomber, painstakingly returned to its wartime configuration, included one historically accurate detail that few in the crowd would have recognized: a modified fuel delivery system based on Wilkins' original design. As the massive aircraft climbed away from the runway at nearly twice the rate the original specifications would have allowed, the announcer briefly told the story of the Nebraska farm mechanic who had saved thousands of airmen with a single unauthorized adjustment. The roar of those four Wright Cyclone engines, climbing strongly into the Nebraska sky, echoed the same mechanical symphony that Wilkins had perfected decades earlier on foggy English mornings when every foot of additional climb rate meant airmen might see their families again. The real tragedy, reflected Thomas Gaines, one of the bombardiers whose life was saved by the modification, is that Wilkins never got to see the full impact of what he did. He died thinking he was a rule breaker who got punished. He never knew he changed aviation history. But perhaps Wilkins did understand the true impact of his work. Mary Wilkins later shared a letter her husband had written to her during the war, after his reassignment to the supply depot. In it, he reflected on the choice he had made. "I couldn't stand at that runway one more day, counting planes that didn't come back, knowing I might have done something. Even if they court-martial me or worse, I've seen 16 modified bombers return with all 160 men aboard. I held their lives in my hands for a few hours while I worked on those engines. My hands don't work so well anymore, but when I close my eyes, I can see those boys coming home. Some things are worth the cost." In 2005, the Air Force Engineering Association created the James Wilkins Award for Innovation, presented annually to maintenance personnel who develop field modifications that enhance aircraft safety or performance. The award citation reads, "For those who see beyond the manual to save lives." Recent recipients have included mechanics who developed improved heat shielding for helicopters in Iraq, and technicians who modified oxygen systems in high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft. For the thousands of airmen who returned safely because their bombers could climb beyond the reach of enemy fighters, Wilkins' sacrifice was beyond measure. For the man himself, it was simply the right thing to do. Protocol be damned. As we reflect on stories of heroism from World War II, we often focus on dramatic moments of combat bravery: the infantry charge, the aerial dogfight, the last stand. But Wilkins reminds us that courage takes many forms, including the quiet, technical ingenuity that saves lives without fanfare. His story asks us to consider the true meaning of service and sacrifice, and whether rules should always prevail when lives hang in the balance. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, in his later years, would often conclude his lectures at the Air Force Academy with Wilkins' story. "Remember this," he would tell the cadets, "sometimes the bravest person on the airfield never leaves the ground. Sometimes the most important battle is fought with a wrench instead of a gun. Sometimes the greatest hero is the one who saves others but cannot save himself." The next time you hear the distinctive rumble of a B-17 at an air show, pay attention during takeoff. Watch as it climbs away more strongly than the original designers intended. In that enhanced performance lives the legacy of a mechanic who knew that sometimes the most important maintenance manual is the one written by conscience when young men are dying unnecessarily. His adjustment did more than make bombers climb faster. It carried thousands of sons, brothers, and fathers back to the people who loved them. And while his hands may have paid the price, his humanity soared. In 2014, archivists at the 8th Air Force Historical Society uncovered maintenance records that included detailed notes on Wilkins' modification. These records revealed Wilkins had documented every step of his unauthorized adjustments, creating a complete engineering package. The notes showed calculations, drawings, and projections that proved remarkably accurate. "He wasn't reckless," explained historian Captain Rebecca Winters. "These records show a methodical engineer who happened to be wearing mechanic's coveralls. He did everything by the book, except following the approval process that would have taken months while men were dying daily." The human cost of delays is stark in the mission records.
In the 3 weeks before Wilkins' modification, the bomber group lost 37 aircraft and 370 men. Had the modification been delayed by the formal approval process, the projected losses would have been catastrophic, over 500 aircraft and 5,000 men. An interview with Wilkins' daughter, Margaret, revealed the personal toll her father's experience had taken. "Dad never really recovered from being punished for saving lives," she recalled. "He would have these moments where his hands would shake uncontrollably, and he'd just stare at them with such sadness. Once I asked him if they hurt, and he said, 'No, Maggie, they don't hurt. They just don't work anymore.' But it was worth it." She shared a story about the nightmares that plagued Wilkins after the war. "He'd wake up counting," Margaret explained, "just numbers over and over. Mom realized he was counting bombers, waiting to see which ones wouldn't come back. Even in his sleep, he couldn't escape that runway." One compelling testimonial came from Sergeant David Miller, a ball turret gunner who credited his survival directly to Wilkins' modification. In an oral history, Miller described a mission over Frankfurt where German fighters attacked during climbout. "The Focke-Wulfs came in below us, expecting to catch us at 6,000 feet. But thanks to our souped-up engines, we were already at 11,000. Their attack run was disrupted. I watched from my ball turret as they tried to adjust and climb to reach us. By then, our 50 calibers were tracking them. We shot down 3 that day. Without that extra climb rate, it would have been us going down." Miller later visited Wilkins' grave, leaving behind his gunner's wings and a note that simply read, "You saved us all. We didn't forget." The technical legacy of Wilkins' work continues to influence aviation design today. Modern military aircraft feature sophisticated full-authority digital engine control systems that automatically adjust fuel flow based on altitude, temperature, and mission phase, a computerized descendant of Wilkins' mechanical solution. When Boeing engineers developed the adaptive engine controls for the B-52 Stratofortress in the 1950s, they cited the Wilkins modification as a conceptual precedent. Dr. Robert Chen, an aerospace engineering professor at MIT who studied the Wilkins case, points to it as a classic example of frontline innovation. "The most elegant solutions often come from people directly confronting the problem," he explains. Wilkins wasn't constrained by corporate thinking. He saw men dying, identified the technical cause, and fixed it with the resources available. That's the essence of engineering at its most pure and most human. The moral questions raised by Wilkins' choice continue to be debated in military ethics classes. Was he right to break the rules when lives were at stake? Should the military have systems for rapid evaluation of field modifications during wartime? How do we balance necessary protocols with urgent innovation? Commander Sarah Jameson, who teaches leadership ethics at the Naval Academy, uses the Wilkins case in her curriculum. "It's easy to say he was right because his modification worked," she notes. "But what if it had failed catastrophically? What if his unauthorized change had caused engines to fail and killed crews? The same action could be viewed as criminally negligent rather than heroic. That's the burden of command decisions. You rarely know which side of history you'll end up on when you make them." The most profound aspect of Wilkins' story is how it reflects the tension between individual moral judgment and institutional authority. In choosing to trust his own understanding over official protocols, Wilkins accepted personal responsibility for the lives of thousands of airmen. Few would willingly shoulder such a burden, knowing that failure would mean not just disgrace, but the deaths of those they sought to protect. Former B-17 pilot Richard Donovan, in his memoir Fortresses Over Europe, devoted a chapter to Wilkins titled "The Man Who Gave Us Altitude." In it, he wrote, "Combat aircrews understood something that headquarters couldn't. Time was measured in lives lost, not days on a calendar. When Wilkins modified those restrictors, he wasn't just improving engine performance. He was racing against a clock where each tick meant 10 more men gone. For those of us who flew, his choice was not just right, it was the only moral option." As the last World War II veterans pass into history, stories like Wilkins remind us of the countless unsung heroes whose contributions shaped the outcome of the conflict.
Their legacy lives not just in museum exhibits or history books, but in the technical innovations that continue to protect service members today. The physical artifacts of Wilkins' story have taken on sacred significance to aviation historians. His original toolbox, donated to the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, contains the modified wrenches and pliers he used to make those first critical adjustments. Curator of Military Aviation, Dr. Thomas Wilson, describes them as humble implements that changed the course of the air war in Europe. Perhaps most moving is the guest book at the exhibit dedicated to Wilkins at the 8th Air Force Museum. Visitors often leave comments reflecting on his sacrifice and innovation. One entry from a retired Air Force mechanic reads, "Thank you for showing us that sometimes the most important part of the job isn't in the manual. Sometimes it's in your heart." In 2010, aviation mechanics organized a memorial fund that provides scholarships to students pursuing careers in aircraft maintenance. The James Wilkins Memorial Scholarship is awarded annually to candidates who demonstrate innovative thinking and moral courage, the qualities that defined Wilkins' approach. Colonel Herbert Wilson, who served as a B-17 commander and later became an aerospace engineer, captured the essence of Wilkins' legacy. In every field of human endeavor, there are those who follow the rules and those who recognize when the rules must be broken for a higher purpose. James Wilkins reminds us that heroism isn't always about what you do in battle. Sometimes it's about what you do in a maintenance hangar when no one is watching. His hands may have failed him, but his heart never did. If you've been moved by this story of unsung heroism, share your thoughts below. Every comment keeps these forgotten histories alive, stories of those who saved everyone but never saved themselves. Thank you for listening to this tale of courage.